Hello, my name is Hans Hanley, and I'll be presenting the work, Specious Sites, Tracking the Spread and Sway of Spurious News Stories at Scale. This work was done in conjunction with Deepak Kumar and Professor Zakir Duremrich at Stanford University. Misinformation has been rife on the internet for decades, with malicious actors often purposely attacking and polluting online ecosystems with bogus information. Despite the pernicious consequences of misinformation, the research community currently lacks public tools to track and understand the spread of these stories in real time, often having to resort to researching these stories after they are already widespread. The gap between when a misinformation story begins to when fact-checkers, researchers, and journalists can address it often results in real-world consequences. For example, on March 17, 2024, several pro-Russian Telegram channels and Russian state media news outlets spread the disinformation story that King Charles III of England had died. These pro-Russian Telegram channels and news outlets spread this message purportedly to draw into question and sow doubt about whether the United Kingdom could maintain its support for Ukraine in the fallout of the death of King Charles. The rumor quickly spread to Twitter, with many seriously wondering on that March Sunday whether the king had died. The following day, the Center for Countering Disinformation published a small report on how several Russian outlets and Telegram channels had started and magnified the rumor online. Due to the rumor, Buckingham Palace issued an official statement. UK's Telegraph and The Guardian wrote pieces reassuring people that the king was alive, and the UK's embassy in Ukraine even tweeted out how this rumor was false. Directed misinformation like this is not limited to easily verifiable stories like this one, but very often extends to a variety of different areas, sometimes inflicting direct real-world consequences. These include conspiracy theories about COVID-19 vaccinations, anti-government and fringe beliefs like QAnon, and rumors about everyday accidents and events. For example, following the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge on March 26th, after it was accidentally hit by a cargo ship, the British influencer Andrew Tate tweeted without evidence about how the ship was cyber-attacked. Meanwhile, the American radio host and conspiracy theorist Alex Jones also tweeted about how the bridge collapse was deliberate and how the accident was potentially the start of World War III. Compounding the issue of how quickly misinformation spreads, researchers, fact-checkers, and journalists all recently have had to face limited API access to social media, which had previously allowed them to research misinformation stories like the death of King Charles. Due to the recent rise of AI and the potential for using user and social data for training new models, companies like Reddit and Twitter have largely restricted researchers from gaining easy access to real-time data and to their platforms. This leads to the question, in this new environment where researchers are no longer able to post-facto research the spread of misinformation via social media APIs, how to track individual news stories and misinformation in a real-time fashion. In this work, we build a system to assist researchers in tracking and understanding the spread of misinformation and news stories called Specious Sites. Specifically, in this work, we 1. Build a system to continuously collect news articles from 1,334 unreliable and politically biased news websites. 2. Adapt a large language model and utilize an optimized version of the DP-Means algorithm to separate the news articles into cohesive narrative clusters. 3. Analyze the ability of different websites to amplify narratives in this news ecosystem. And finally, 4. Determine the efficacy of fact-checkers in correcting unreliable news narratives. Before delving into some of our results and some applications of our work, we will first give an overview of our methodology. To begin, we first scraped and crawled our set of 1,334 unreliable and politically biased news websites to gather news articles.
We gathered this set of 1,334 websites from previously created lists of politically biased, misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and state-based propaganda websites that were labeled as such by other studies.
We subsequently daily queried the RSS feeds and the homepages of these websites for newly published articles, gathering a total of 1.92 million articles from between January 1st, 2022 and November 1st, 2022. To supplement our dataset, we further added any missed news articles that were published during this same period of time by gathering the set of news articles from our set of websites that were indexed by Common Crawl. While this system has continued to run to the present, for this presentation, we focus on the news articles published between January 1st, 2022 and November 1st, 2022. Each day, upon gathering the newly published news articles, before inputting them into a large language model and determining their narratives, we pre-process them using several different Python libraries, extracting out English language article text. Upon extracting the article text, for each news article, we subsequently divide its content into paragraphs based on the placement of new line and tab characters and finally take out 100-word passages from each paragraph for use in our embedding model. The reason we segment our articles into individual passages, rather than inputting the entire article, is 1, due to the context window of the large language model that we utilize, and 2, often within news articles, several different narratives or ideas are put forth, and we want to be able to differentiate between these different narratives. For example, in this single article about property values from the New York Times, one paragraph is about some of the pitfalls of property value taxes, and the other is a personal anecdote about a retiree. As such, with our method, we would want to potentially separate these two paragraphs into different narratives. Upon extracting our article passages, we finally embed them using an encoder large language model fine-tuned for semantic similarity tasks, for later use in clustering and identifying narratives amongst our news articles. Within this work, we specifically utilize a version of the MPNet encoder model as a base for future fine-tuning. This encoder large language model is such that, taking 4 passages, 3 of them being about propaganda stories of Ukrainian neo-Nazis, and 1 of them being about Ukrainian-developed bioweapons, upon embedding them, the 3 passages about Ukrainian neo-Nazis would be close to each other in the embedding space, while the story about Ukrainian bioweapons would be further away. To ensure that the encoder large language model that maps our passages to our embedding space is specifically fit towards our news data, we further utilize unsupervised contrastive learning to further fine-tune our model. This is such that we take our encoder large language model that is already fine-tuned towards semantic similarity tasks, and then repeatedly input article text, twice with dropout, through our embedding model as positive pairs, the rest of the text embeddings being considered negative, and then fine-tune our model with a contrastive loss. Benchmarking our encoder large language model against several others on the semi-vol semantic textual similarity test sets, we find that our additionally fine-tuned version performs the best. Upon embedding all of our article passages to identify particular narratives, we then utilize DP-means clustering to isolate particular narratives within our news passage dataset. DP-means is a non-parametric extension of the k-means algorithm that does not require the specification of the number of clusters a priori. Given the size of our dataset and the unclear amount of narratives present within our news articles, this enables us to not have to immediately specify the number of narratives beforehand. Furthermore, DP-means allows us to specify the amount lambda a data point must be prior to DP-means creating a new cluster, allowing us to pinpoint how close we wish our news passages to be in the corresponding embedding space before considering them to be about different news narratives. To select a threshold for clustering our news articles using DP-means, we benchmark our model on the English section of the semi-vol STS22 dataset. This dataset grades 2 columns of news articles on whether they are about the same news narrative. Using this dataset and further performing our own intensive manual evaluation, we ultimately choose a cosine similarity of 0.6 for clustering. See our paper for further details. Upon using DP-means clustering, we identify 52,000 news narratives amongst our set of unreliable news websites. Clustering these stories took approximately 1.5 days using an A6000 GPU. Finally, after isolating our set of 52,000 news stories, to make these narratives easily human understandable, we subsequently extract keywords and summaries of the contents of each cluster. To do this, for each cluster, utilizing point-wise mutual information, we extract out the set of keywords that are most characteristic of each cluster, and then further utilize a separate large language model to summarize the contents of each cluster based on the article passages within them. Having given an overview of our methodology, we now give a brief overview of some of the results that we find after analyzing our news article clusters. Looking at some of the top narratives written about in 2022, we see a heavy emphasis on the Russo-Ukrainian war, inflation, and Elon Musk's acquisition of X, formerly known as Twitter. In terms of the websites that wrote most extensively about these topics, we observed several well-known unreliable news outlets, including those like the Russia media websites, Southfront and Russia Today, and the conspiracy-oriented and misinformation-laden websites Zero Hedge and the Epoch Times. Looking at how these narratives developed over time, we see several instances where particular narratives, like former U.S. President Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate being raided by the FBI, quickly spiking in popularity. Other narratives, such as inflation, were largely constant throughout our period of study. Examining specific misinformation and propaganda stories, for example, the idea of killer COVID-19 vaccines, Ukrainian neo-Nazis, and there being rampant voter fraud in the 2020 U.S. presidential election, using our methodology and seeing how often particular websites wrote about these stories, we can ascertain which websites most heavily promoted these well-known misinformation narratives. Unsurprisingly, for the propaganda story of the Ukrainian government being filled with neo-Nazis, several Russian propaganda outlets, such as Russia Today, Sputnik News, and Global Research were the most prolific. For killer COVID-19 vaccines, we see that the Epoch Times, Pandemic News, and Vaccine News most heavily promoted these stories. Finally, for 2020 election denialism, we observed that WeLoveTrump.com, TheGatewayPundit.com, and VoterFraud.com were the most prolific. While examining the number of articles that each website wrote about particular narratives enables us to understand how each story was potentially influenced by specific websites, we now turn to estimate the full influence that particular websites had on the unreliable news website ecosystem. Specifically, we estimate the effect on the unreliable news ecosystem that a website has when it originates or amplifies a particular narrative. To do this, we directly compare the number of articles that are published by other websites when a given website originates a narrative, namely when it is the first to publish an article about a given narrative, to when it does not originate a narrative. We weight the external articles published within a given narrative by the inverse of each article's website's respective popularity as determined by the Google Crux rankings. We utilize this metric to get a better idea of the overall influence that a website would have when originating an article. For example, getting one's narrative republished on Breitbart or Russia Today is likely to be more influential than getting it republished on Pandemic.news, a relatively unpopular website. We further compare the number of articles that are published by other websites when a given website amplifies a narrative, namely when it writes about a narrative early in that narrative's lifecycle to when it does not. We define early in a narrative's lifecycle to be prior to when 15% of the total articles about that given narrative have been written. You can see our work for additional details and the results of this amplification analysis. Examining the set of websites that are the best at originating narratives that are then picked up by the rest of the unreliable news ecosystem, we see that several otherwise small, fringe websites like InfoStormer are particularly good at creating content that is later picked up by the rest of the ecosystem. InfoStormer, with a header labeled The Jewish Problem, writes heavily sensationalist and anti-Semitic perspectives on the news that is taken up by other fringe websites. We observe a small to moderate Pearson correlation of 0.229 between a website's popularity as determined by Google Crux data and its ability to originate and perpetuate narratives amongst other unreliable news websites. In addition to examining the influence of particular websites within our news ecosystem, we further estimate the influence that fringe social media websites like Akoon and 4chan have on the unreliable news ecosystem. Akoon is an anonymous image board where the conspiracy theory QAnon began, and 4chan is also an anonymous image board known for its role in internet culture, its free speech ethos, and alt-right political movements. Taking the messages posted to these forums from the same period as our study, we first determined which narratives overlapped between our set of news websites and Akoon and 4chan. On Akoon, many of the shared narratives had to do with the Russo-Ukrainian War, anti-Semitic tropes, and the trucker convoy protests in Canada. On 4chan, we further observed a heavy emphasis on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, white supremacy, and again, several anti-Semitic tropes. Looking at the narratives that were originated and amplified by these two social media platforms, using the same methodology that we utilize for our news websites, we observed that while 4chan originated and amplified more narratives than Akoon, Akoon originated and amplified narratives were more likely to result in a larger number of articles on the news websites that we studied. In addition to examining which websites are some of the most influential in promoting narratives that then spread throughout the unreliable news ecosystem, we can further, by examining day-to-day increases and week-over-week increases of particular stories, determine whether there is a new potential misinformation story that is being spread. This analysis can help fact-checkers determine what is important to fact-check based on its popularity amongst unreliable news websites. For example, in the last week of our study, the story that received the most relative increase in traction amongst our news websites was about an assault on former U.S. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi. Indeed, as reported by the New York Times, this story led to a torrent of disinformation that lasted for weeks. Using our system, journalists and researchers would have been able to automatically anticipate this. Finally, having gone over our system's use for identifying and tracking particular websites and narratives that may need additional scrutiny and fact-checking, we now illustrate our system's use in determining the efficacy of different websites in fact-checking those narratives. Specifically, we estimate the number of stories and the rate at which they were fact-checked by the fact-checking divisions of AP News, Reuters, and PolitiFact. To do this, we utilize a combination of semantic search combined with a DiBerta trained model, fine-tuned on the fact-checking dataset Fever, to identify which stories amongst our news narratives were fact-checked, and how long after the narrative started were they fact-checked. For example, say that we had a fact-check of there being no widespread election fraud in the US 2020 presidential election from one of our fact-checking websites. We would then utilize our MPNet encoder large language model to identify the set of narratives that the fact check is semantically similar to amongst our set of unreliable news websites. Upon identifying the set of narratives whose cluster centroid has at least a 0.6 cosine similarity to the fact check, the same similarity threshold that we utilize for differentiating different narratives, we subsequently input the fact check along with the corresponding passages within the cluster into our fine-tuned DiBerta classifier. The DiBerta classifier classifies the relation between the fact check and the passage from one of our websites, determining whether there is a contradiction between the two passages, an agreement, or if the two passages are unrelated. For this work, given that we wish to focus on cases where AP News, PolitiFact, and Reuters fact-check our set of unreliable websites, we focus on cases where the fact-check and the passages contradict each other. Looking across AP News, Reuters, and PolitiFact, we see that Reuters and PolitiFact fact-check the most articles and that all three often fact-check narratives near when the narrative peaks in popularity in terms of the number of articles published on that day. Despite this, the median number of days that a story was able to spread amongst our set of unreliable news websites before being fact-checked was often months. In conclusion, in this work, we utilize fine-tuned large language models and the DP-means algorithm to track and trace different misinformation websites in a human-interpretable way. Using our methods, we identify which set of misinformation websites are particularly good at magnifying and originating different types of narratives. We further show that we can identify new potential misinformation stories that should be fact-checked by looking at the rapid increase in news articles amongst our set of unreliable news websites. We finally find that there is oftentimes a delay between the spread of misinformation and fact-checking. Our study highlights the need to programmatically detect the rise of false narratives in real time. Prior work has shown that misinformation can spread much faster than legitimate news, and our analysis finds that false narratives can often start on small, seemingly unpopular websites. In many cases, these false narratives, as was the case with the QAnon conspiracy theory, can spread for months online before being fact-checked. As such, we are currently exploring how best to publicly and continuously release real-time updates of our narrative analysis as an online dashboard while protecting against misuse. Thank you, and you can find me at the following links.